Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you the complete family tree of French monarchs, all the way from the Merovingian king Clovis I to Emperor Napoleon III. I'll mostly be using my European royal family tree West chart, but since that starts at Charlemagne, I'll also be using my Roman emperors chart because that one includes the earlier Merovingian dynasty. If you want to buy either of these charts as posters, you can do so by heading over to our website, usefulcharts.com. We've got 1,361 years to cover, so let's get to it. The history of the French monarchy begins during the final decades of the Roman Empire in the West. During the reign of Valentinian III, the Roman general Attius had to fight off an invasion led by Attila the Hun. Helping Attius were several barbarian warlords, one of which was supposedly a man named Merovech. It was from his name that we get the label Merovingian. We don't know much about him or his son Childeric, aside from the fact that they were in charge of a subset of the Germanic Franks, known as the Salian Franks, who lived just south of the Rhine River. However, by the time Childeric's son Clovis became leader, the situation in Europe had changed dramatically. The entire western half of the Roman Empire had fallen, and therefore Clovis was able to unite all of the Frankish tribes under his rule and conquer most of what is today called France. The name Clovis is the origin for the later name Louis, which, as you probably know, was the name used most often by the kings of France. After the death of his first wife, Clovis married a Burgundian princess named Clotilda, the Burgundians being another Germanic tribe that set up a kingdom after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. She was a Christian, in particular a Nicene Christian, and she managed to convince Clovis to convert as well. Thus, from this point forward, the Merovingians were a Christian dynasty. Now, much later in the 20th century, an idea started to spread that the Merovingians were actually the descendants of Jesus himself. This idea comes from the book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which links the Merovingians to the Fisher Kings, who, in Arthurian legend, were the guardians of the Holy Grail. This idea, made even more popular by the book The Da Vinci Code, involves Jesus marrying Mary Magdalene and producing a bloodline that leads to the Merovingian kings. It all makes for a good story, but unfortunately, there is no historical basis for it. Now, originally German law, called Salic law, after the Salian Franks, held that a king's land should be divided among his sons, rather than the whole thing going to a single heir. Therefore, Clovis's kingdom was divided among his 4 surviving sons, which is why the dates for these kings overlap. However, through a series of wars and genealogical coincidences, all 4 of the mini-kingdoms eventually ended up in the hands of the youngest son, Clothar I. He in turn then divided his kingdom amongst his 4 sons. But then a similar situation occurred, in which the 4 mini-kingdoms became just 2. One, called Austrasia, was ruled by Childebert II, and the other, called Neustria, was ruled by Clothar II. And there was an intense rivalry between the mothers of these 2 kings, Brunhilde and Fredegund. Intense is putting it lightly, because not only did they arrange the assassinations of each other's husbands, they were supposedly responsible for assassinating many others as well. Brunhilde is likely the inspiration for Brunhild, the character for whom the phrase, "it ain't over till the fat lady sings," comes from. I should also point out Saint Bertha, the daughter of Charibert I. She married the King of Kent in what is today England, which led to him converting to Christianity and then eventually all of England. Anyhow, Clothar II eventually inherited all of Francia, and for the next 100 years, his descendants either ruled in Austrasia or Neustria, or sometimes both. However, during this period, the power of the king decreased, and the power of a position called the mayor of the palace increased. Two early examples of this were Pepin the Elder and Grimoald the Elder. In fact, Grimoald managed to get the Merovingian king Sigebert III to adopt his son, and for a brief period, that son became King of Austrasia. However, it would be through Grimoald's sister, Saint Begga, that his family would eventually get the crown. She was the mother of Pepin the Middle, who served as the mayor of the palace under 4 Merovingian kings. His son Charles Martel is the namesake of the Carolingian dynasty. Starting out as mayor of the palace, he became the acting king following the death of Theodoric IV. Then, during the reign of Childeric III, the switch between the Merovingian dynasty and the Carolingian dynasty became official, with Childeric III being deposed and replaced by Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short. Pepin the Short was followed by his son Charlemagne, which simply means Charles the Great. He's called the Great because he greatly expanded the Frankish kingdom, conquering the kingdom of the Lombards in Italy, where in the year 800 he was crowned Emperor of the Romans, becoming the first person in Western Europe to hold that title since 476. It's at this point that we must now switch over to the European royal family tree West chart. So at the start of this chart, the Kingdom of the Franks is now the Empire of the Franks. However, continuing the Merovingian custom, Charlemagne originally planned to divide his kingdom between his various sons. The plan was for Charles the Younger to get most of Francia, Pepin to get Italy, and Louis to get a small kingdom in southern France. However, both Charles and Pepin died before Charlemagne, and therefore Louis the Pious ended up inheriting the whole thing. Note that in the counting of the kings of France, Charlemagne is considered to be Charles I, and Louis the Pious is considered to be Louis I, although they are also Charles I and Louis I in the counting of the Holy Roman Emperors. It was following the reign of Louis the Pious that the Frankish lands were divided in a way that would become permanent. His son Charles the Bald received West Francia, which would go on to become France, whereas his sons Lothair and Louis received Middle Francia and East Francia. East Francia would go on to become Germany, which was the main part of the Holy Roman Empire. From this point forward, we will therefore only concern ourselves with the heirs of Charles the Bald, shown in blue. In the numbering of the kings of France, he is considered to be Charles II, and his son is considered to be Louis II. When Louis II died, his 2 eldest sons reigned as joint kings, but they both died young, leaving their younger brother Charles as the sole heir. But he was only 5 years old at the time, so at this point, the throne of West Francia was briefly usurped by the king of East Francia, Charles the Fat. But when Charles the Fat was deposed, the French nobles decided to elect a non-Carolingian as king, a man named Odo, son of Robert the Strong. But by the time Odo died, Charles from the Carolingian dynasty was now a man, so the nobles decided to switch back to him. He became Charles III, although he is mostly remembered as being Charles the Simple. However, after 24 years on the throne, he ended up making some bad decisions, which led to him being deposed and replaced by Odo's brother, Robert. So, as you can see, the monarchy was very unstable at this point and waffled back and forth several times between the Robertians and the Carolingians. Robert I was followed by his son-in-law, Rudolph, and when Rudolph died, it looked as though the throne might pass to Robert's son, Hugh the Great. But Hugh the Great decided to support the return of the Carolingians instead, helping to place Louis IV on the throne. However, he wasn't simply being altruistic. The situation actually allowed him to become the power behind the throne without having the dangers that come with actually sitting on the throne. Thus, we get 3 more Carolingian kings, Louis IV, Lothair, and Louis V. However, upon the death of Louis V, there were no male line Carolingians left, at least not any legitimate ones. Therefore, the nobles elected to put Hugh the Great's son, Hugh Capet, on the throne, thus establishing the House of Capet, which would go on to become the longest-lasting royal dynasty in all of European history. Take note that paternally, Hugh Capet was the grandson of Robert I, the King of France, but maternally, he was also the grandson of Henry the Fowler, the King of Germany. So this house has some pretty strong roots. Hugh Capet was followed by his son Robert II, and then by Robert II's son Henry I. Henry I married Anne of Kiev, the daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, from the Rurikid dynasty. So take note that from this point forward, all the kings of France have some Kievan Rus blood in them. Also note that Henry I's brother, Robert, Duke of Burgundy, was the great-grandfather of Alfonso I, who was the first king of Portugal through a strictly male-only line. This means that all of the kings of Portugal, including the later House of Aviz and House of Braganza, which were founded by illegitimate sons, were nonetheless male-line descendants of the House of Capet. Henry I was followed by Philip I, then Louis VI, and then Louis VII. It was Louis VII who participated in the Second Crusade and who was initially married to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was the reigning Duchess of Aquitaine, an important region in southern France. However, her marriage to Louis VII was eventually annulled, after which she married Henry, who went on to become Henry II of England. She was thus the only woman in history to serve as both Queen Consort of France and Queen Consort of England. It was because of her marriage to Henry II that England was able to build the Angevin Empire, which resulted in the English controlling most of Western France. But back to France. Through Louis VII's second marriage, he became the father of Philip II, who became not only the next king of France, but one of France's most celebrated medieval kings, because it was he who captured most of France's lands back from the English, putting an end to the short-lived Angevin Empire. In fact, it was Philip II who was the first to use the style King of France, rather than King of the Franks. So, in a sense, he can also be considered to be the first true King of France. He's also remembered for having participated in the Third Crusade, alongside Frederick Barbarossa. He was followed by Louis VIII, who prior to becoming King of France was briefly King of England. Kind of. I say kind of because he was never crowned. He was, however, declared king by some of the English nobles, who preferred him over the unpopular King John. He even managed to capture about half of England before being driven out during the first year of Henry III's reign. Like I say, Louis VIII did eventually become King of France, only to rule for about 3 years before being succeeded by his son Louis IX. Louis IX holds the distinction of being the only French king to have been granted sainthood. During his reign, France experienced a golden age. Not only was it the wealthiest kingdom in Europe and the one with the largest army, it was also the center for all things artistic and intellectual. If you're an American, you might also find it interesting to note that St. Louis of France is the namesake of St. Louis, Missouri, even though that city was founded almost 500 years after his death. During the reign of Louis IX, a junior branch of the House of Capet also reigned as emperors in Constantinople. These included Peter, the son of Peter, Lord of Courtenay, and Peter's sons, Robert I and Baldwin II. I should also point out that Louis IX had a younger brother named Charles, who also became king, not of France, but of southern Italy. He conquered it from Manfred, an illegitimate son of Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Later, Manfred's son-in-law, Peter III of Aragon, managed to capture the island of Sicily, but Charles and his descendants managed to hold on to the mainland kingdom of Naples for the next 160 years. Strangely, another one of Charles's descendants became the king of both Hungary and Poland. This is because Charles's son, Charles II of Naples, married a Hungarian princess, and then one of their grandsons married a Polish princess. Their son became Louis the Great. He reigned in Hungary for 40 years and in Poland for 12 years. But Louis the Great died without any sons, and therefore the House of Capet's reign in those two countries died as well. But in France, it continued. There, Louis IX was followed by Philip III, and then by Philip IV, who married the reigning Queen of Navarre, meaning that their son, Louis X, became the king of both France and Navarre. By this point, the House of Capet had experienced 11 straight father-son successions, a rare thing for medieval royal houses. But their luck would soon stop. You see, Louis X died without any sons, but while his wife was 4 months pregnant. So there was a chance that the father-son successions would continue. And what do you know? 5 months later, the queen did in fact have a boy named John, who instantly became king. But John died after just 5 days, and therefore the House of Capet's streak came to an end. At this point, John's uncle, Philip V, became king. But he had 3 daughters and no sons. So after he died, the next king was his brother, Charles IV. But once again, history repeated itself. Charles IV died without any sons, but while his wife was pregnant. This time, when the baby was born, just 1 week later, it was a girl, which posed a big problem in terms of the succession, because there were now no more brothers left to take the throne. However, Charles IV did have a sister named Isabella, who had married Edward II of England. This meant that the new English king, Edward III, now had a good claim to the French throne. However, if the French wanted to stay within a strict male-only line, they could also simply go back 1 generation and look to the descendants of Philip IV's brother Charles, the Count of Valois. He had a son named Philip, and in fact, the French decided to make him king as Philip VI. This marked the beginning of the 100 Years' War, in which Edward III of England fought to capture the throne of France, which he thought was rightfully his. This is why, for the next 470 years, the kings of England, and later Great Britain, incorporated the coat of arms of France into their own. It also marked the beginning of the reign of the House of Valois in France, although note that the House of Valois was not really a new house, but rather a junior branch of the House of Capet. The English won the first phase of the 100 Years' War, but did not manage to gain the throne. Thus, the next French king was John II, followed by Charles V. During the reign of Charles V, the second phase of the 100 Years' War occurred, and this time the French gained the upper hand. The third phase started during the reign of Charles VI, and it concluded during the reign of Charles VII, with a decisive French victory. However, I should mention that by this point, the House of Valois no longer held the throne of Navarre. Back when Charles IV died, it went to John I's sister Joan. Anyhow, Charles VII was followed by Louis XI, and then by Charles VIII. He married Anne, the reigning Duchess of Brittany, and thus from this point forward, what had previously been the independent Duchy of Brittany became part of the Crown of France. Together they had 3 sons, but all 3 died as infants. Therefore, when Charles VIII died, the throne passed to his second cousin once removed, Louis XII, who was a member of the House of Valois via a junior branch. Louis XII married the previous king's wife, Anne, and thus she became the only woman to serve as Queen of France twice. Together they had 2 daughters, but no sons. Their eldest daughter, Claude, married the next most senior member of the Valois family, and therefore when Louis XII died, the next king was Francis I. Francis I was a contemporary of Charles V, who was both Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Spain. By this point, an intense rivalry between the houses of Valois and Habsburg had developed, and it reached its peak during the reigns of these 2 rulers. Mostly, they fought over Italy, where Francis I briefly became the Duke of Milan. However, after just 6 years, he was captured in battle and forced to give up the duchy, confirming that Spain was now the dominant power in Western Europe. However, in order to curtail the growing power of the Habsburgs, Francis I did something that no major Christian power in Europe had ever done up to that point. He allied with a major Muslim power, the Ottoman Empire. This Franco-Ottoman alliance lasted for over 250 years and led to important cultural and scientific exchanges between the two powers. It was also during the reign of Francis I that the French explorer Jacques Cartier laid claim to what he called Canada on behalf of France. This area would later become a part of New France, until it was eventually captured by the British and transformed into the country of Canada we know today. Francis I was followed by Henry II, who died unexpectedly at age 40 when he was hit in the eye by a piece of wood flying off a splintered lance during a jousting tournament. This led to his son Francis II becoming king at age 15. He was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, and had he lived, this might have led to an interesting union between Scotland, France, and perhaps England. But he did not live. He died after just 1 year on the throne, resulting in his younger brother Charles IX becoming king. By this point, the Protestant Reformation was in full swing, and tension between Catholics and Protestants was rising. During Charles IX's reign, the conflict became a full-out war, known as the French Wars of Religion. The Protestant side, known as the Huguenots, were dealt a major blow in 1572 when perhaps as many as 30,000 of them were killed during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. However, one person that escaped was the future Henry IV of France, who at the time was a Protestant and the King of Navarre, having inherited that throne from his mother. We'll come back to him in a moment, but first, let me mention Henry III. Prior to inheriting the throne of France, he was actually elected as the King of Poland-Lithuania. This is because it was expected that Charles IX would have a son, and that therefore Henry would be free to reign in Poland-Lithuania. But when Charles IX died unexpectedly in 1574, Henry abdicated in Poland-Lithuania and became King of France instead as Henry III. But Henry III didn't have any sons either, and therefore when he was assassinated in 1589, the House of Valois came to an end. However, there were still several other male line descendants of the House of Capet from other junior branches. If we go back up to Louis IX, we see that he had a son named Robert, who had a son named Louis, who had received the title Duke of Bourbon. By the time of Henry III's assassination, the most senior descendant in this line was this Henry, who, as I mentioned earlier, had become the King of Navarre through his mother. He had also married Henry III's sister, Margaret, making his claim to the throne even stronger. So even though he was a Protestant, Henry IV became the next king of France, and in doing so, he established a new royal house, the House of Bourbon. Although again, remember, this was not really a new royal house. It was just another branch of the House of Capet. Henry IV and Margaret of Valois were not able to produce any offspring together. So in order to make sure that the House of Bourbon continued, they actually agreed, quite amicably, to have their marriage annulled, which allowed Henry to take a new wife, Mary de Medici. This time the couple did have a son, and thus when Henry IV became the second French king in a row to be assassinated, the throne passed to Louis XIII. During his reign, the crown of Navarre was officially merged with the crown of France. It was also during his reign that the first French settlements in Canada started to take off. However, it was his son, Louis XIV, who became the most famous Bourbon king of all, if not the most famous of all French kings. He is sometimes called Louis the Great, but more often he's referred to as the Sun King. He reigned for a whopping 72 years, which is the all-time verifiable record for any monarch in all of world history. During that time, France became Europe's most powerful country, as well as a major center of art and innovation. One of his greatest achievements was his victory in the War of the Spanish Succession, in which he managed to get his grandson Philip V put on the throne of Spain, because Philip was also the grandson of Philip IV. Philip V's older brother Louis, the Petit Dauphin, actually had a better claim to the Spanish throne, but he was in the direct line to inherit France. So this way the country could continue to have two different kings. But not only did Louis XIV outlive his son Louis the Grand Dauphin, he also outlived his grandson, the Petit Dauphin. And therefore, when he died, the throne of France went straight to his great-grandson, who became Louis XV. Dauphin, by the way, means dolphin, and was the title used for the heir apparent to the throne of France, kind of like how Prince of Wales is used in the UK. Louis XV was not as successful in war as the Sun King. Following the 7 Years' War, which in North America was called the French and Indian War, France was forced to give up the Canadian parts of New France to Great Britain and the territory of Louisiana to Spain, which basically left France with nothing. But Louis XV did have a long reign, long enough to outlive his son, so that when he died, the throne went to his grandson, who became Louis XVI. But Louis XVI had it even worse than Louis XV. Louis XV lost his colonies. Louis XVI lost his head. He had the unfortunate luck of reigning during the French Revolution. In 1792, he and his wife, Marie Antoinette, were sent to the guillotine when France decided it wanted to get rid of its monarchy and become a republic. Their 7-year-old son is considered to have become Louis XVII at this point, but he never did reign. Instead, he was sent to prison, where he died at age 10. Over the years, there have been many rumors about him having survived, and even several people who later claimed to be him. But in more recent years, scientists were able to do DNA testing on some remains and determined that the boy who died in prison was almost certainly Louis XVII. The First French Republic lasted for only 12 years. It was followed by the First French Empire, during which time the military commander, Napoleon Bonaparte, took the title Emperor of the French and managed to conquer most of Europe. But a coalition of other European powers managed to eventually defeat him, at which point the old monarchy was restored, with Louis XVI's brother becoming Louis XVIII. But what do you know? Louis XVIII didn't have any children. So when he died, the throne passed to yet another brother, Charles X. But then France decided to have another revolution. But this time they didn't want to abolish the monarchy. They just wanted to have a different kind of monarchy, a nice liberal one in which the king had to follow a constitution. They even had someone in mind for the job, Louis Philippe, a descendant of Louis XIV's brother, Philippe. He founded the House of Orléans, which is a junior branch of the House of Bourbon, which in turn is a junior branch of the House of Capet. So here's what happened. Charles X was forced to abdicate. This automatically made his son Louis the king, as Louis XIX. But Louis XIX reigned for only 20 minutes. Technically, he was then followed by one of Charles X's grandsons, named Henri, who reigned for about a week as Henry V, before it was made clear that Louis Philippe was now the king. Not the king of France, but king of the French. But by this point, France was getting used to having revolutions, and in 1848, they decided to have yet another one, this time ushering in the Second French Republic. But the Second French Republic lasted for only 3 years. It was replaced by the Second French Empire, during which time Napoleon I's nephew reigned as Napoleon III. He was called the Third because technically Napoleon II, the son of Napoleon I, reigned for 3 days following his father's first abdication and 2 weeks following his second. Napoleon III ended up becoming the last monarch of France because in 1870, France decided once again to become a republic. And this time it stuck, and France has been a republic ever since. So that brings us to the end of the French monarch's family tree. However, if you're interested in finding out who would be king or emperor of France today if it decided to restore its monarchy, we've got a separate video on that topic, which I'll link to on screen right now. Thanks for watching.